Hey everybody, I'm Joe Killinger. I'm a real estate investor and entrepreneur, and we put these videos together every week to give you all the tips and insights from my experience over the last several years. So make sure you tune in and subscribe, and thank you. Everybody, thank you for tuning in. We had a YouTube subscriber, I can't talk today, reached out to us, asked if we could break down what they should be looking for in a lease and the due diligence that they should take a look at when analyzing a triple net lease. So I asked George Pino, he's the CEO of Commercial Brokers International here in Los Angeles. You've seen George on this show several times. George, thank you for taking that long journey in. So this was an interesting question and something that, I probably should have thought about doing a video some time ago, because it is a...
It's definitely interesting, because a lot of times, people look at single tenant net lease or ground lease type transactions that they're buying, and they always hear that it's like the safest investment, and they think that they have a long-term lease with a potentially corporate guaranteed tenant, so they don't have to do the necessary due diligence. And really, they do. Ultimately, they're still buying a property, so there's all the stuff that they would normally do. Now, it may be a little bit smoother, easier or so, but there's definitely stuff that you do need to do when it comes time to evaluating the property.
And the franchisee.
The franchisee, who it is. Yeah. Now, number one is, of course, going to be the lease.
Right.
And typically speaking, those leases can be anywhere from 30 to 80, 90 pages. So a lot of times an attorney may take a look at it, and they'll
I would suggest the attorney does take a look at it.
Absolutely. Well, it's best, especially if you're not very familiar with a lot of the commercial terminology. But within the lease, there's a couple things that you want to make sure that you are getting. Mm-hmm. Number one is that the person who's the guarantor is actually signing the lease, or if they're not signing the lease, that there's an actual guarantee from them. What I mean by that,
who else have you seen in your experience that has tried to sign a lease?
Well, here's what's interesting is that a lot of times franchisees, not a lot of times, I should say, some franchisees will play a game that, they're larger franchisees, they may own 200-300 locations. Okay. You think you're getting a 200-300 location guarantee, then all of a sudden when you get the lease, and a lot of times they're marketed franchisee with 200 locations, but when you get the lease, it's a sub LLC that may only have 20 locations in that LLC. So it's a little bit of a game, especially if there's multiple states in the South or so, or with geographic regions. You have a lot of franchisees that may have multiple states that they are franchisees in, so they'll keep a new LLC in every single state. Okay. So that's something you want to make sure. Who is your guarantor? Mm-hmm. Obviously, the little stuff like the terms and the terms of the lease, the increases, the options, those you just look at to make sure that they are correct. Okay. When it comes to some of the other clauses that you might want to look at, that I have found, early termination clauses in a lease. They're usually not advertised, for good reason, but sometimes they're hidden in there. So you look to see if there's any kind of early termination clause, and then from there, a lot of times the lease will have form estoppels and SNDAs. So SNDA is a subordination non-disturbance agreement that you typically get from the lender for the tenant. So you want to make sure what your requirements are going to be.
What is that SNDA? What does that spell out?
Well, basically, it's protection for the tenant. So the tenant has their form, but the lenders also have specific forms that they like to use. So we want to make sure that the SNDA that they've agreed to is going to be admissible or acceptable to a lender that you're using if you're getting financing. Now, the SNDA, essentially, what it does is it will, it subordinates the lease, hence the subordination. Sure. And then non-disturbance agreement, the NDA part of it, is that if the lender has to foreclose on it, as long as the tenant is paying rent, they will not disturb them. Okay. So basically, even though the lease is subordinated, there is a non-disturbance agreement that states that if the lender takes over the property, they will not evict them. Okay. Okay? So those are some of the things that we'd like to look at. A couple things also, though, and the question that came out that I saw was specifically on leases, but I'd also like to delve a little bit more into some of the other due diligence items that I think any potential buyer is going to want to
Sure,
look at.
yeah.
You know, and whether you're getting financing or not, especially if you're getting financing, the lender's going to require this. But even if you're not, you should possibly look at it anyways, and I would recommend it.
Now, this is all gonna be state by state too, right? Now, I know you've done deals in 30-some states, but have you seen, is there
Generally
significant changes
speaking,
in each state?
Not really, no. And in fact, what I'm kind of going over a little bit is a little bit more general. I think if anything changes, it's going to be more about the asset class, meaning there's potentially more due diligence that you're going to want to do when it comes to a gas station or auto use type property versus a fast food type property. So, you know,
Or environmental with the gas stations?
environmental, but also filing and taking a look, going back, not just doing a phase 1 or phase 2, but seeing if you can get records and histories of any kind of leaks or contamination, NFA
tanks,
letters,
yeah.
no further action letters, things like that. So any kind of reported spills. So those typically, depending on the state, some state it's public information, some state it's not. So you may have to go after and do a little bit more delving into it. But that's really more for a auto use type property. When it comes to the typical properties, you are still going to want a phase 1. And you know, the phase 1 basically is going to go back and do a history search on the property, see what has historically been at that location, and it will red flag high use or high environmental potential risks.
Okay.
So if there was a dry cleaner on the site, perhaps,
Oh, yeah.
20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, before they built a fast food location, they're going to call that out. And in fact, dry cleaners tend to be some of the heaviest contaminated sites, so what they will do is you'll probably require phase 2, which is testing. There's also some potential phases, like a part of the phase 1 is that it may be a gas station, but they may have, in the past, they may have removed the tanks, and there may be an NFA letter, in which case then you won't.
NFA letter?
NFA means no further action, so that's typically a letter that's given by the
got all these little
governmental authority, and it essentially says that there is no further action necessary
Okay,
after
so
the
it's cleared,
removal of the
yeah.
tanks, and it's been cleared.
That's on a gas
So
station.
that's on a gas station
Okay.
or pre-existing gas station. So
Okay,
I've
yeah.
seen some C stores or convenience stores
Yeah.
that have previously been gas stations, and you know they've either closed out the gas part or and kept the convenience, and for whatever reason. So those would still require that. The other thing to take a look at next, and every lender is going to require this. So if you're getting a loan, you're going to have to get it, and you're going to have to order it right away. Is a survey.
Right.
So the survey typically is going to take anywhere from 14 to 20 days to get, and same with the phase 1. But so you're going to want to make sure you build in that due diligence time frame. But the survey, what's nice is they're going to go out to the property and they're going to plot out everything that's on title, meaning it's going to look at any easements, where the lot lines are, make sure that there are no encroachments, so that you know that what you're buying, the property is not encroaching on somebody else, or for that matter, someone else is not encroaching on this property, which could potentially cause tax issues or some other issues down the road.
Lawsuits from the neighbors.
Lawsuits from the neighbors, things like that,
All
absolutely.
the fun stuff you want to stay away from.
Yeah, and then lastly, and this is one that is probably about 50-50 with my clients. You know, some clients don't want it or don't care for it, but a lot of them, they look for the future. Meaning, if this is worst case scenario, if I have to re-tenant it, who can I re-tenant it to? So they'll order a PZR report, which is a property zoning report. And this will actually go in and take a look at the zoning and make sure that the current use is, it's zoned for the current use, and also what other uses you could potentially do for that zoning.
Okay.
So it allows for that. So those are pretty much it when it comes to the actual third-party vendors and reports. When you're doing your own due diligence, location, location, location. I'm sure you've heard that.
Signalized intersections.
I heard, absolutely, but more importantly, even if it's a signalized intersection, if you can delve into it, have your broker pull up the traffic counts.
Yeah.
You know, you want to see what the traffic counts are, because you want to see if it matches what the tenant's expectations are for the area. Also look at the demographics, the trending demographics, what they are now today, but also what they're going to be in 5 years and what they were 5 years.
Right.
So you want to see preferably a
Where
area
that
that's
community's
growing.
going, yeah.
You know, as opposed to many communities are getting smaller and smaller. So those are areas that you might want to stay away from, because if it's a downsliding with the income as well as growth, then there's a better likelihood or higher likelihood that the tenant may not renew the lease if their sales drop. Speaking of sales, sales history, if you can get them, absolutely fantastic and great. The problem that you run into a little bit when it comes to that is most leases don't require sales reporting nowadays. So a lot of times they don't have that, but if you can get it, fantastic. And then it's just a matter of evaluating the rent to sales ratios and making sure that they're paying what is affordable to them or even better.
What do you think is it? What's the best ratio you've seen out there?
You know,
Rent to sale ratio.
it's going to depend on the type of asset class. That's
Throw it under the bus.
a curveball because different companies work on different margins. So
Right.
you have different sales to rent ratios. And in fact, like a coffee company will have a much higher rent to sales ratio percentage than a fast food company. Most restaurants gear for 10% or less.
Okay.
Okay. Really good is 5%. Good is 8%. So 8% of the sales is their rent. 5% we see a lot of times on really good assets. That way you know that there's actually upside potential in the property.
Okay.
From there we start looking at the, if you start looking at drugstores or grocery stores, their rent to sales ratios should be a lot lower, less than the 5% ratio, because even though they're doing, their margins are a lot tighter. So you have to realize that because the margins are tighter, they can pay less in rent versus what their sales are. So it's really a factor of what type of asset class and where they are. So one thing that I think is really good to know, especially when it comes to tenants that have recently renewed leases, and you see this all the time, and this is a way for a seller or landlord to actually create the value, because the value of the property is tied to the length of the lease. So
Right.
when you have a longer term lease, it's considered a safer investment, and therefore the cap rate is compressed and you get a higher price. So even if the rent's the same, so meaning if you have a single tenant net lease asset that has 1 or 2 years remaining on the lease, and they're paying, let's just call it $100,000 a year in rent, versus a exact same single tenant net lease asset with a brand new 20-year lease paying the exact same rent, it's potentially worth $300,000 to $500,000 more. So a seller is going to try and renegotiate or restructure that lease before they go to sell it. A couple things to ask about when they do, because a lot of people don't, is what kind of concessions were given to the tenant to get them to sign this lease. That's number one.
Just gonna ask you.
Number two is were there any? Is the tenant giving anything? Meaning, a lot of times a tenant has to remodel their building to meet current brand standards if they're a franchisee.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when you tie in a new lease, you might give them a little bit in exchange for them remodeling the property, which is actually good for everybody, because
Sure.
historically speaking, a remodeled location with a new location increases sales by 10%, which is a big number.
It is.
So, you know, that's a potential value add opportunity for everybody that's in there, both the tenant and the landlord or the buyer in this case. So those are the things to really look at. And, you know,
I got a question for you. Now, what is the average length of lease? Now, I know you've done a good number of these, so when you do a transaction, you buy a triple net asset, what is typically the length of the lease, the timing left on the lease?
okay. Again,
Does that really matter to you? I mean, let's say.
absolutely.
So if you're really looking, if there's 2 years left, you really look at, you go in and analyze the property and go, okay, if this person doesn't renew, if I can't renegotiate the lease, I can re-tenant this with these other franchisees?
Always look for
franchisors.
Franchisors or different brands, different locations, different stores. We're always looking, for me, I'm always looking for my clients as far as what's the exit strategy?
Right.
What are you going to do if they
Well,
don't
every good
if they don't
investor
renew the lease?
Better be, yeah.
But more importantly, I also, when I initially look at a property, I am finding the right properties that fit the client's needs. Meaning,
Sure.
if the client may be a newer investor, may not have a large portfolio of assets, or may not have a lot of liquidity, then and need financing, and depending on what kind of financing they're looking at, whether it's maximizing out at a 65% loan to value, or doing a 50% loan to value, or under 50%. So that all plays a factor in the role, because frankly, if you get a lease that's 5 years or less, it's going to be extremely difficult to finance. So if my buyer is getting any kind of financing, I'm probably going to tell them that, you know what, you're going to have huge personal guarantees, it's going to cut the down payment. So I'm not going to put that in front of someone that's trying to maximize their leverage opportunities.
How much more is a down payment on something?
Generally speaking, you're looking at, most lenders will want a under 50% loan to value. Okay, and they will normally do a loan that is coterminous with the lease length, meaning if there's 5 years remaining, they'll give you a 5-year lease. But the beautiful part about commercial real estate is that you can negotiate commercial leases as well, or commercial loans as well, so that if you have 5 years remaining on the lease, the loan may expire in 5 years, but you can also build in that it'll automatically extend if they exercise their option.
Okay.
So there are ways to get around some of it, but it varies on the lender, and because of that, and because there's less lenders out there, just like any supply and demand or competition, interest rate's going to be a little bit higher as well.
Yeah.
So because the lenders look at it as higher risk, interest rates are a little bit higher, anywhere from 25 to 50 basis points, and the term's a little bit lower. So if you're looking for more of a stabilized asset, then you're looking for longer term leases, typically speaking at least 10 years. Most of the fast food QSR type leases are 20 years in term. Most of the other type of leases are 15 years as far as new lease terms, meaning the C-stores, the gas stations, the auto zones, the drugstores tend to be 20 plus, but generally speaking, most of them are going to be in that 15-year range for new leases, and then QSRs are typically in that 20-year range. Some 15, but most.
QSR, quick service, fast food. So.
Quick service restaurant, absolutely.
Yeah, a restaurant, yeah. Okay, so just to kind of recap, we've got the different asset classes. Let's talk about gas stations first.
Okay. Well, for gas stations, really it's probably going to require the most due diligence of all the different asset classes. Because of the tanks, the environmental issues, things like that. Also, what you have to worry about is, just because it's branded, you have to make sure that who the lease guarantor is. Okay. Whether it's if it's Circle K, is it a Cartouche? Which is a Canadian company that's guaranteeing the lease. Yeah. You're welcome. But depending on who it is, or it may very well just be a franchisee. So just like anything, you want to determine that.
Okay. Look at the numbers for the franchisee.
Absolutely.
Make sure the tanks are in good standing. And if they have, make sure all the documentation's in place. Make sure you take a look at it. So anything else?
Yeah, just normal stuff, the terms, options, the increases, early terminations, ask the same questions that you would anywhere else as far as any kind of past concessions on a lease renewal. Yeah. If it's new construction, then it's more about, what the nice part about new construction is they already have a lot of the environmentals.
Sure.
So you're going to be able to get some of that. You're probably going to be able to get a survey, cut some of the cost down, mitigate some of the risk if you decide that you don't want to actually do it yourself, if you're buying all cash. So there's definitely some things to do. As far
now, I got a question.
Yes.
Now, let's say you're buying one and it's been a Chevron for 5 years, but previous to that it was another gas company, and there might be damage that's been long term, and these guys didn't do the paperwork properly. Is the first gas station liable?
Potentially.
Okay.
And actually, it's interesting. It depends on the state, and because each state's different laws.
Right.
So, some states will have it, they actually may go after ownership, but other states may go after the actual tenant.
Okay.
So when it comes down to the tenancy, like for instance in California, if you had a corporate guaranteed gas station that was perhaps like a Mobil or United Oil, way back in the day, back in the 70s and 80s,
Yep.
and now there's a franchisee there that's XYZ brand.
Right.
You end up finding out that there is contamination on the land.
Mhm.
You could potentially go back to that mobile guarantee or, the large corporate guarantee from way back in the 70s and 80s
Yeah.
and have them be held responsible for mitigation and cleanup.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it can
So-
be, now, do you remember we had that one in Long Beach where it was jet fuel was contaminated?
Yeah.
Jet fuel it spreads very quickly and goes a long distance.
Yeah.
And so, you've got to do your due diligence on this part of it. Okay, so let's go to quick service restaurant, QSR, top things you should be looking for.
QSRs, again, main thing when it comes to the lease is who's the actual guarantor. Make sure it's not hidden, make sure it's not in there. Make sure that there are certain things also tied to the options, meaning when you look at the lease, part of what I look for is also lease structure.
Yep.
Meaning, if I see something that's out of the norm, it's probably going to devalue the property.
Yeah.
And case in point, there are some older drugstore leases that have a initial term of 10 years and 50 one-year options. So
What a mess.
it's a mess, but and they're actually advertised as 50-year leases or
Sure.
60-year leases.
Yep.
But the problem is a one-year option, really you only have a one-year lease. And that's how any lender's gonna look at it, and that's how you should look at it as a buyer or
Yeah.
owner, is, the option is in the tenant's favor.
Sure.
So if that's the case, what are my exit strategies?
Well, how often do you just go in and renew that or renegotiate that lease? Is that something you do, or, they've got you already, so they're probably not gonna wanna renegotiate it? Unless you come in with, hey, listen, I'll completely fix up the property and.
Yeah, when it comes to renegotiating lease, and that would be a great opportune time for a new video, because we're gonna go into it, that's a lot of information, but the short answer is that a tenant's not gonna there's no reason for a tenant to renegotiate a lease unless they have something in their benefit, meaning they have no more term left,
Right.
or maybe you're offering them concessions on the rental rate, so, they may be paying $200,000 a year, but you're gonna offer them a new lease at $180,000, and it may sound crazy to do that, but you can actually still increase the value by doing that, depending on the
There's a
lease
lot of
structure and
ways
where
you
you're
can do it,
at.
and I think you're right, that is gonna have to be another
Yep.
video because it's gonna be lengthy.
Yep.
All right, pharmaceutical, a QSR, drive-throughs, make sure you really, especially with the pandemic and maybe it's gonna come back, we don't know. Drive-through is something you always want. If you can get one with a drive-through, that's always a safe bet because that has really helped a lot of companies stay alive during this. So, okay, pharmaceuticals.
Pharmaceuticals, and actually before we get into that, let me just actually throw something in regarding the drive-throughs. One thing that's really interesting about drive-throughs, Starbucks did Starbucks model originally was no drive-throughs.
Right.
Now they pretty much are going straight to drive-throughs. Same with Chipotle. Chipotle used to never have drive-throughs. Now they just want Chipotle lanes or
Right.
something with a drive-through. They're even retrofitting some buildings to
Sure.
add drive-throughs. So what's interesting is that Starbucks study, the average Starbucks that with a drive-through does 2.5 times more business than one without a drive-through. So it increases the
Really?
business that
That's a
much
big
more.
number.
It's a huge number. That's mainly for Starbucks, but at the same time, more than half the sales for most QSRs come from drive-throughs.
Right.
So if you're looking at that,
Especially now.
right now, I think even higher.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at that, what you want to do is realize that what we talked about earlier, rent to sales ratios. So if their sales are so much higher, they can afford that much more rent.
Yeah.
So something with the drive-through is going to add that much more value. So jumping back to your last question on the pharmaceutical companies, You know, the one thing I like about the pharmaceutical companies, again, it's all about the lease structure, who it is. The guarantor you don't have to worry about necessarily because they're all guaranteed by the corporation, but the lease structure I think is probably the most important thing to look at there. That is specifically the options and the increases.
Mm-hmm.
Also make sure that it's, and this is actually something I probably should have mentioned early on for all lease and asset classes, and I can end it with that because I know we're getting a little bit long here, but one thing,
there's so much good information.
There's so much good information.
You know, we wanted to do this, it was going to be a short video, and then we got started, and we're like, oh man, there's a lot more to this than we realized.
Yeah. So, but one of the things I really like, or one of the things I think that everyone really needs to look at when it comes to the leases, is that the structure, you want to make sure that it is a true triple net lease.
Yeah.
And you know, I've had instances where my client and I, or my client's gone into contract on a triple net leased property, and we find out later on, as once we get the lease, that it's really not triple net, it's a double net plus.
Yeah.
You know, so there are certain carve outs, and it was never advertised as that. So I've actually, and you know, that's a bad job on the listing broker side. We canceled escrow on those, but you
Well,
know,
that goes to, that's a good segue into representation.
yeah.
You need to have a good, experienced broker finding you this stuff, because they need to know what's in that lease. A good broker and a good attorney, because it's things like this, somebody that's not so experienced would have probably just went ahead and done the deal and found out down the road it's a double net. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
So, you know, I think, you know, we have a couple of good ideas for some topics for the future.
Yeah.
I think this is a really good start. I hope I didn't add more to the confusion of, and I hope I answered the question.
No, I think,
asking.
you know, and if you do, if any of you do have a question for George, we're going to put his contact information down below. Reach out, ask questions. You can go on the YouTube channel if you haven't done so. As a matter of fact, if you haven't done that yet, please do go subscribe. You know, and then of course like this video. But reach out, ask questions. Don't get yourself into a situation where you're getting into a lease and then you get yourself in trouble. So, and there's one thing that, you know, a lot of people say, triple net is the safest investment. There is no safest investment. Probably the most
maybe
liquid.
safer.
It's safer, but it's not
or
the
more
safest.
liquid, but it's definitely more liquid.
Things happen, and so this is why this video, I think, and I'm very thankful that George came in to do it, because doing your due diligence and understanding that lease is key to your success. Make sure you do all this before you buy your first property, and make sure your representation is solid. So, George, thank you very much for doing this again. We will keep doing these on TripleNet, so again, please do subscribe to the channel. We'll keep putting this content out for you. And thank you for tuning in today.